The doorman crossed his arms before the man finished climbing the steps. It was a small movement, barely perceptible in the low light of the entrance, but it was deliberate, and the man climbing the steps noticed it the way he noticed most things, quietly and completely, filing it alongside everything else he had seen in the past 40 seconds since he turned the corner onto Aldrin Street and the entrance of the Founders Club came into view. The entrance was exactly as he remembered it. The dark stone facade, the recessed lighting above the door, the twin planters with the clipped boxwood that he had specified himself, because he believed that the approach to a place said something about what waited inside. And he had wanted the approach to say that what waited inside was worth the walk. The brass plate beside the door was new, recently polished, catching the light in the way that things caught light when someone had taken care of them. He noticed this too. His name was Carter Wells. He was 43 years old, wearing a dark charcoal coat over a gray sweater and dark trousers. He was not wearing anything that announced itself. He carried nothing that performed wealth. He had his 10-year-old son beside him, Marcus, who was wearing a blue jacket and the expression of a boy who had been told this evening was going to be interesting and was reserving judgment until the evidence arrived. Marcus had his father's eyes and his mother's jaw and the particular quality of attention that came from being raised by a man who believed that the world rewarded people who looked at it carefully. He was currently looking at the doorman with that quality of attention and had already noted the crossed arms. "Good evening," Carter said. He stopped at the top of the steps and looked at the doorman directly. The doorman's name was Vincent. He was in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the bearing of someone who took the authority of his position seriously. He had been at the door of the Founders Club for 11 months. Which was long enough to know the regulars and short enough not to know everything he should have known. "Sir," Vincent said in the tone of someone managing a situation they had already assessed, "the Founders Club is a private members' establishment. Membership is by invitation only." He paused. "Do you have your membership card?" Carter looked at him. "I don't carry a membership card," he said. "I'm not a member." Vincent's posture settled into the confirmation of something he had already decided. "Then I'm afraid I can't allow you entry," he said. "This is a private facility. Non-members aren't permitted without a registered guest invitation from an active member in good standing." Carter said. "I'd like to speak with your manager," Vincent said. "Our club manager is occupied with members this evening. I'm not in a position to interrupt that," Carter said. "His name is Jeffrey Marsh. Tell him Carter Wells is at the door." Something moved through Vincent's expression. Not recognition, not yet, but the specific uncertainty of someone who had been handed a name that sat differently than expected and wasn't sure what to do with the difference. "One moment," he said. He did not move from the door. He spoke into the small earpiece at his collar, his voice low enough that Carter could not hear what he said. Marcus had moved to stand slightly beside his father, rather than behind him. The specific repositioning of a 10-year-old who had decided this moment required his full lateral presence. He looked at the doorman and then at the brass plate beside the door and then at his father. "What does the plate say?" Carter asked him quietly. Marcus looked at it. "The Founders Club," he said. "Eastern 2009. Carter nodded. He said nothing further. He stood at the top of the steps in the cool evening air and waited with the patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that waiting was not the same as losing. The door opened from the inside. A man in his early 50s appeared, trim and composed in a dark suit, with the bearing of someone who managed a room for a living and had developed strong instincts about what any given situation required. His name was Jeffrey Marsh, and he had been the club manager of the Founders Club for 6 years. And he had met Carter Wells exactly twice, both times in this building, both times in circumstances that had involved paperwork and decisions, and rooms that looked nothing like the entrance where he was currently standing. He took in the situation in a single sweep. Vincent at the door, Carter and the boy on the steps, the particular quality of the silence between them. His expression changed. "Mr. Wells," Jeffrey said. He stepped forward and extended his hand. The warmth in his voice was not performed. It was the warmth of genuine alarm badly managed. "I apologize." Please come in. Vincent had turned slightly. Something in his posture had shifted in the way that postures shifted when the geometry of a situation changed beneath them. Carter shook Jeffrey's hand. His expression had not changed since he arrived at the top of the steps. He looked at Jeffrey, then at Vincent, then back at Jeffrey. He said, "Thank you, Jeffrey." He put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and they walked through the door. The interior of the Founders Club was exactly what it had been designed to be, which was a room that made a person feel immediately that they had arrived somewhere. The entrance hall was paneled in dark wood with a floor of warm stone, the lighting low and precisely calibrated, a broad staircase rising at the far end of the space, the sound of quiet conversation coming from the rooms beyond. A large framed photograph hung on the left wall of the entrance, black and white, showing the exterior of the building in an earlier state. Before the renovation, before the opening, before any of it had become what it was. Marcus looked at the photograph. He looked at the building in it, which was clearly the same building but different, older and less certain of itself, and then he looked at the room around him and made the connection that 10-year-olds made when they had been taught to look at things properly. Was it different before? He asked. Carter looked at the photograph. A lot different, he said. How? Carter thought about how to answer that in the way that was true and also something his son could use. He said it was empty. Just a building. It didn't know what it was yet. Marcus looked at the photograph for another moment. Who made it know? He asked. Carter said, some people I worked with, and some decisions made a long time ago. Marcus looked at him. Were you one of the people? Carter said, yes. Marcus nodded. He filed it. They moved further into the club. Jeffrey walked with them, not hovering, not managing, but present in the way that someone was present when they understood they owed a person their full attention and were trying to provide it without making the provision itself into a spectacle. He said, quietly as they moved through the entrance hall, I want to address what happened at the door. Carter said, we'll talk about it. Not now, Jeffrey said. Of course. They came into the main drawing room, the large central space of the club's ground floor, with its arrangement of seating areas and the long bar along the north wall and the fire that was going in the stone fireplace at the far end. The room was perhaps 2/3 full, the steady Thursday evening occupation of a members' club in good standing, people in pairs and small groups, the specific quality of conversation that happened, in rooms where people felt comfortable and unobserved. Marcus walked beside his father and looked at the room with the expression he wore when he was conducting an inventory. He had been in the club once before, 2 years ago, but he had been 8 then, and the memory was general rather than specific. He was 10 now, and his memory had become the kind that retained detail. He said, I like this room. Carter looked at it. What do you like about it? Marcus thought about it seriously. The way it sounds, he said. Not too loud. Like everyone's talking, but nobody's performing. Carter looked at his son. He thought about the conversation he had had 14 years ago with the architect, a woman named Diane, who had strong opinions about acoustics and had spent 45 minutes explaining to Carter why the shape of a room affected the way people behaved in it. He thought about how he had listened to all 45 minutes and then approved the acoustic treatment she recommended because he trusted expertise when it was backed by conviction. He said to Marcus, that's because of the ceiling. Marcus looked at the ceiling. It didn't look special. Carter said, it's treated. The way the sound moves through it is designed. Someone thought very carefully about it. Marcus looked at the ceiling for another moment with the expression of someone revising their understanding of an object. Then he looked at his father. You thought about it? Carter said, someone I trusted thought about it. I listened to her. Marcus processed this. He said, is that how you build things? You find people who know things and listen to them? Carter looked at his son. He said, that's most of it. The rest is deciding what you actually want to build and not changing your mind when it gets hard. Marcus nodded slowly. He was filing this in the place where he filed things that were going to matter later. Jeffrey had arranged a table for them near the window, one of the smaller seating areas along the east wall with a view of the street below, and they settled into it with the ease of 2 people who knew how to occupy a space without requiring it to perform for them. A server named Anna came and introduced herself and asked what they would like. And Marcus ordered with the specific seriousness of a 10-year-old who had been taught that ordering food in a restaurant was a real transaction and deserved real attention. He chose thoughtfully and thanked her when she wrote it down. And Anna looked at Carter with the quick, expressive glance of a person communicating approval of a child's manners without making it awkward. And Carter received it the way he received most things, quietly and without comment. While Marcus looked out the window at the street below with the absorbed attention of a child who found cities genuinely interesting, Carter looked at the room. He looked at it the way he always looked at the things he had built. Not with pride exactly, though pride was present, but with the specific attentiveness of someone checking the distance between what a thing was intended to be and what it had actually become. The Founders Club had been his idea in the way that things were a person's idea when they arose from an absence so specific that filling it felt less like creation and more like correction. He had spent 12 years in this city building a business and attending the events and dinners and gatherings that his professional life required, and he had spent those 12 years moving through rooms that welcomed certain people before others and dismissed certain people before anything had been established. And he had reached a point where the feeling of that dismissal had clarified into a question he could not stop asking, which was what it would look like to build a room where that was not the operating assumption. He had not built the Founders Club as a statement. He had built it as an answer to a question. The question was whether a private member's establishment could be built on the principle that the credential that mattered was character rather than category, that the person who deserved a seat at the table was the person who brought something real to it, regardless of what they wore when they arrived or who they looked like when they came through the door. He had built it quietly, under Reedstone, under holding companies, under the names of the partners and investors who had come in with him, because he was not interested in the building being about him. He was interested in the building being what it was supposed to be. He had done most of the conceptual work himself, with Diane the architect and a small team of people he trusted, and the result was this room, which was 14 years old and which worked, by the measure that mattered most to him, which was the measure of whether the people inside it felt like they belonged there or like they were being assessed. He thought it worked. He thought it worked most of the time. Tonight had been a piece of evidence that it did not work all of the time, and that was the piece he was going to have to sit with and then address. Jeffrey came to the table when the food arrived, timing it with the professional instinct of someone who knew when an interruption would be least intrusive. He asked if he could join them for a moment. Carter said yes. Jeffrey sat and looked at Carter with the directness of a man who had been preparing what he wanted to say and had decided that preparation was better served by honesty than diplomacy. He said, "Vincent has been with us for 11 months. He was trained by the previous door team and his training covered protocol correctly. What it did not cover, what I did not cover, was the specific situation of an owner arriving without identification." He paused. "That's a gap in our induction process that I should have closed a long time ago. I didn't close it because I assumed it would be covered by context." He looked at Carter steadily. "I was wrong about that." Carter listened. Then he said, "What did Vincent think he was doing?" Jeffrey said, "His job." He thought he was doing his job. "The protocol says members show credentials. Non-members don't enter." He followed the protocol, Carter said. "And the crossed arms before I reached the top of the step?" Jeffrey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That I can't speak to with certainty. What I can say is that it's something I'm going to address directly in a conversation with Vincent tomorrow morning." Carter said, "I'd like that conversation to be a training opportunity rather than a disciplinary one." Jeffrey looked at him. He said, "May I ask why?" Carter said, "Because Vincent followed a protocol that was incomplete. That's a systems failure, not a character failure. He's been here 11 months. If we discipline him for following what he was taught, we teach everyone watching that the problem is Vincent." "The problem is not Vincent." Jeffrey held his gaze. He said, "That's a more generous reading than most people in your position would apply." Carter said, "I'm not interested in generosity for its own sake. I'm interested in the thing actually getting better. Those aren't always the same response." Jeffrey nodded slowly. He said, "I understand the distinction. Carter said, "Good. Then let's design the training together." "I want to be involved." Jeffrey looked at him. He said, "I wasn't expecting that." Carter said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you directly." He looked at the room. "This place works because the people in it know what it's for. When the people in it stop knowing what it's for, it stops working. I've been watching that not happen for 14 years. I'd like to keep watching it not happen." Jeffrey said, "You'll have whatever you need." Carter nodded. He looked at Marcus, who had been eating with focused attention through the entire conversation and had clearly been listening to all of it while appearing to attend only to his food, which was a skill Carter recognized because it was a skill he had taught him. Marcus said, without looking up from his plate, "If the doorman didn't know who you were, how do you know it was about how you look and not just the rule?" The table went quiet. Jeffrey looked at the boy with an expression that moved through surprise into something more attentive. Carter looked at his son. He said, "I don't know that for certain." Marcus looked up. "Then how do you decide what to do about it?" Carter thought about this with the seriousness it deserved, because it was a real question, and his son had earned a real answer. He said, "You look at the whole picture. You look at when the decision was made, which was before I reached the top of the step. You look at what information was available at that moment, which was how I looked and nothing else. And then you ask yourself whether the decision would have been made the same way if the information had been different." Marcus said, "Would it?" Carter said, "I think probably not. But I'm not certain, which is why the response isn't to punish Vincent. It's to build a system where that particular uncertainty doesn't get to make the call." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He said, "That's smart," Carter said. "I learned it from someone who built things for a long time and made a lot of mistakes doing it." Marcus said, "Who?" Carter said, "Your grandfather." Marcus looked at this information from several angles. "He said Grandpa made mistakes?" Carter said constantly. "He was just good at learning from them." Marcus appeared to find this reassuring rather than troubling. He returned to his food with the expression of someone who had received something useful and was done with the topic for now. Jeffrey excused himself a few minutes later. He shook Carter's hand and said he would be in touch by end of week with a proposed training framework. Carter said he would review it. Jeffrey left the table and went back to the management of his evening, which was the work he was good at and which he returned to with the specific quality of someone who had been handed a new frame for what good management meant and was already applying. Carter and Marcus stayed for another hour. They talked about Marcus's school project, which was a presentation on bridges, and which Marcus had strong opinions about in terms of which bridges were the most interesting and why. Carter listened and asked questions, and Marcus answered them with the authority of someone who had done the research and was confident in the conclusions. At one point, Marcus said, "Can we come back here?" Carter said, "Whenever you want." Marcus looked at the room. He said, "I want to bring Jalen. He's my friend who thinks he doesn't belong in places like this." Carter looked at his son. He said, "Why does he think that?" Marcus said, "Because nobody's ever taken him to one." Carter held his son's gaze for a moment. He felt the specific quality of a thing he had built arriving through a 10-year-old's friendship at exactly the purpose it had been built for. He said, "Then we'll bring Jalen." Marcus nodded. "Done." He went back to his food. They left an hour later. The evening air was cool and sharp, the city going about its Thursday business around them, indifferent and continuous. Marcus walked beside his father with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of someone still processing a full evening. Halfway down the block, he said, "Daddy," Carter said. "Yeah," Marcus said, "the doorman." "Do you think he felt bad?" Carter said, "I think he probably felt confused, and then probably felt bad when he understood the confusion." Marcus said, "Is that enough?" Carter walked for a moment. He said, "It's the beginning of enough. What comes after is the part that matters." Marcus considered this. He said, "Like the training," Carter said. "Like the training." Marcus nodded. He said, "Okay," in the tone he used when something had settled. Into a place he was satisfied with, they walked the rest of the way to the car in the specific, comfortable quiet of a father and son who had been through something together and were both still holding it, turning it over in the way that things got turned over when they were worth understanding completely. Carter drove home through streets that carried no record of his name, past buildings that had no sign of his involvement, through a city that continued to operate without any visible acknowledgement of the things he had built inside it. He had built them that way on purpose, not from hiding and not from false modesty, but from the understanding that the work was the point, that the room was the point, that the person who walked through the door and felt immediately that they had arrived somewhere worth arriving, that person was the point, not the name on the paperwork, not the face behind the holding company, not the man in the charcoal coat at the top of the steps. The room. Always the room. Marcus was asleep by the time they reached their street, his head tilted against the window, his blue jacket still on because he had not quite made it to the point of taking it off before sleep arrived. Carter parked and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, looking at his son's face in the rearview mirror, at the street outside, at the ordinary, unremarkable fact of a Thursday evening concluded. He thought about Jeffrey's training framework. He thought about the conversation he would have with Diane, the architect, about the 5th project, a space that had been forming in the back of his mind for 2 years, smaller than anything else he had built, more specific, designed for a purpose he was only now finding the language for. He thought about Marcus saying, "I want to bring Jalen. He thinks he doesn't belong in places like this." He thought about a room that answered that, a room that said, from the entrance, from the approach, from the brass plate beside the door and the lighting above it, that the question of belonging had already been answered, and the answer was yes. "Come in. This was built for you, too. This was built especially for you." He got out of the car. He opened Marcus's door and lifted his son, who was 10 years old and heavier than he used to be but still manageable, and carried him inside and up the stairs and got him into bed without fully waking him, because some things did not need to be interrupted just because they had reached their natural ending. He stood in the doorway of his son's room for a moment. The blue jacket was on the chair. The city was outside the window, lit and continuing. Carter Wells went downstairs and made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about rooms. He had been thinking about rooms his entire adult life. He expected he would keep thinking about them for whatever came next. There was always another room to build. There was always another door to get right. That was the work. That had always been the work, and he had never once run out of reasons to keep doing it. The training framework arrived on Saturday morning, delivered to his email at 7:42 with the precision of a man who had spent Friday working on it and had sent it the moment he was satisfied rather than waiting for a more conventional hour. Carter read it over his first cup of coffee while Marcus was still asleep upstairs. It was good. Better than good. Jeffrey had not simply addressed the gap in Vincent's onboarding. He had rethought the entire orientation process for door staff, building into it a module that Carter had not suggested but that reflected, with striking clarity, exactly the principle Carter had been articulating for 14 years. The module was titled The Purpose of the Door, and its central premise was that the function of door staff at the Founders Club was not to determine who was worthy of entry, but to ensure that everyone who entered felt immediately that the entry was right. That the door existed to welcome rather than to filter. That the credential being checked was not membership in a formal sense, but membership in the human sense. The simple fact of being someone who had come to a place worth coming to and deserved to feel that. Carter read it twice. Then he replied with 3 words. "This is right," Jeffrey replied within 4 minutes. "Thank you. I'll implement it Monday." Carter put his phone down and looked out the kitchen window at the Saturday morning street, at the ordinary movement of people going in the directions they had chosen, at the city assembling itself for the weekend with the unhurried ease of something that had been doing this for a long time and knew the rhythm of it. He thought about the brass plate beside the door. The Founders Club, Esther 2009. He had been 30 years old when this idea had first taken shape in his mind. Young enough to believe that an idea could become a building if you were willing to do the work between the idea and the building. He had been right about that. He had been right about most of it, and wrong about enough of it that the right things had become worth something. He had not been right about Vincent. Not because Vincent had done something unforgivable, but because the system Carter had built had not prepared Vincent for the specific situation of an owner arriving without identification, and that was a gap in the system that Carter owned as much as anyone. You could not build something and then stand outside it and call the gaps someone else's problem. The gaps were yours. The gaps had always been yours. He thought about Marcus saying that's smart, and about the particular quality of the word smart in a 10-year-old's mouth when it was genuine rather than reflexive. He thought about Marcus saying, I want to bring Jalen. He thinks he doesn't belong in places like this. He thought about what it meant to build a room that answered that sentence before it was spoken. A room whose answer was in the door and the approach and the light above the entrance and the sound the room made when it was working.